Hello student, how are you all? I hope you all are alright. So today we are going to start with the topic the Age of Wordsworth. In the previous video we have already discussed about the older poets. Now we are going to discuss about the younger poets of the Age of Wordsworth. The later revolutionary age. The close of the French Revolution did not mean the end of the revolutionary movement. Even in the field of politics, the people of Europe had been aroused and were not now to be crushed or pacified. Hence repeated disturbance in Spain, Portugal, Italy, Greece and much dangerous discontent in England. But meanwhile, as we have seen, a strong conservative reaction has set in. Many of the older generation abandoned their early faith, and for a time the principle of progress and popular government suffered eclipse. The complacency of Toryism, however, was impossible in many of the more fiery spirits among the younger men. Growing into manhood just in time to realize the full meaning of what seemed to be the failure of the democratic cause, they found themselves in a world which had emerged from the long strain of revolutionary excitement, exhausted but not satisfied. The old enthusiasm and hope had gone, and their collapse was followed here by apathy and indifference, there by the cynicism which often results from exploded idealism, and there again by the mood of bitter disappointment and aimless unrest. Such were the conditions which naturally went up heavily upon the English. English poets who were born into the later revolutionary age. Yet every man will respond to the influence of his time in accordance with the peculiarities of his own genius and character. And though the three chief poets of our younger revolutionary group, Byron, Shelley and Keats, breathe the same atmosphere and saw the same forces at work about them, nothing could well be more striking than a contrast between each in the quality of temper of their poetry. Byron, the eldest of the three, George Gordon Lord Byron, is in the largest sense also the more thoroughly representative, because more than any other English writer he expressed that spirit of rebellion at once comprehensive, passionate and impotent, which was one of the silent features of his age. His own temperament and stormy life helped him to become its mouthpiece. Born in 1788, he sprang from a wild, unruly stock, and from his father and mother inherited that irritable and volcanic character which repeatedly brought him into conflict with man and things. Hardly more than a boy, he published a little volume of verse, Hours of Idleness, which was ferociously attacked by the Edinburgh Review. To this attack he replied in a vigorous satire, English bards and Scotch reviewers. A tour on the continent in 1809 to 11 furnished the material for the first two cantos of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, in which descriptions of the places he had visited were combined with historic memories and much melancholy meditation upon the instability of human grandeur and power. Published in 1812, these two cantos scored an immense success. I wake up one morning, said Byron, and found myself famous. Then for a time he was the idol of the brilliant and dissipated society of the Regency, and amazed and delightful his thousands of readers with the force, emotions and highly colored scenery of his romances in verse, the Giaour, the Bride of Abydos, the Siege of Corinth, the Corsair. In 1850 he married. A year after he had his wife separated, a scandal broke out. He was execrated and denounced as a monster of iniquity by the very public which had lately loaded him with extravagant adulation, and he left England. He left England an embittered man. The remainder of his life was spent on the continent, and it was during these years of exile that he produced his greatest work, Manfred Khan, the third and fourth cantos of Childe Harold, and the unfinished Don Juan. In the end, weary of everything, of fame, the poetry, even of himself, he threw himself into the cause of Greece. Then, struggling for freedom against the Turks, took the field and died in 1824 of fever at Missolonghi before he had completed his 37th year. Byron wrote with almost incredible facility, and his work is not only very voluminous but also including as it does lyrics, satires, narratives, poems, serious and serio-comic, regular tragedy, and dramatic poems, apparently very varied. But the variety is only apparent, for Byron was a supreme egotist, and no matter what the form adopted, rarely traveled outside himself, the result being that the final impression left by his poetry is an impression not of variety but of monotony. As a critic and theorist, he proclaimed himself an adherent of the Augustan school, admired Pope, cared little for Wordsworth or Coleridge, and compared the poetry of the 18th century with Greek temple and that of his own time with the barbarous Turkish mosque. Yet, as he himself admitted, no one had done more than himself to substitute the mosque for the temple, for whatever principle the entire weight of his practical influence was on the side of romanticism. Lapse of time and changes both the feeling and of taste have played havoc with his poetry as a whole. Much of it that held its first reader spellbound now seems tawdry and commonplace. He is often noisy and declamatory rather than poetical, and at times at least he is guilty of pose. But with all his carelessness and his many faults, he has amazingly vitality and power, and in his most impassioned moods his verse rushes on like a torrent. He is at his best in description, especially when he blends description with meditation. As a poet of nature, he is most at home with nature's wilder aspect. He loves mountains and storm, and he glories in the sea because of its utter indifference to man. It must be added that a satirist, he is incomparably the greatest of modern English poets. His place in the literature of his age has already been indicated. It is suggested by the very word Byronism, which we still use to denote the spirit of gloom, satiety, and unrest which is characteristic of most of his writings. As a revolutionary poet, he represents the destructive side of the revolutionary movement only. Of its utopianism and social aspirations, he knows nothing. He had no faith in older order, and in many places, as in the brilliant vision of judgment, he pours merciless ridicule upon the spent force of the ancient feudalism and monarchy. But he had no new faith to offer the world in place of the old, and his philosophy ends in blank negation. Vanity of vanities is the keynote of it. He is an apostle of liberty, but he conceived liberty in terms of pure individualism. The heroes of his romances are pirates, corsairs, outlaws, Ismails. In his Childe Harold, Manfred Khan, Don Juan, he idolizes all who are in revolt. Revolt against society, nor does he stop with his attack upon society. If society is rotten, the whole universe too is out of joint. He is therefore a rebel against the very conditions of human life. against what men have called the way of providence and the moral order. In Don Juan, he turns the batteries of his satire upon the conventions and hypocrisies of society. In Cain, he produces the terrific indictment of God's dealing with man as interpreted by current theology of his time. Shelley. Byron then is our great interpreter of revolutionary iconoclasm. Percy Bysshe Shelley, on the contrary, is our revolutionary idealist and our one poetic prophet of faith and hope in a world which for the moment had lost both. He was the son of Tory squire, was born in 1792, and after some unhappy years at the Eton, where he was nicknamed the Mad Shelley, went up to Oxford, whence however he was soon expelled for publishing a pamphlet on the necessity of atheism. An ill-advised marriage with a mere schoolgirl, Harriet Westbrook, led to open rupture with his family, and Shelley found himself adrift. After the tragic death of his young wife, he married Mary, the daughter of William Godwin, whose influence on his mind was already immense. This second union proved a very happy one, for in Mary he had an intellectual companion and a comfort and stay amid all the troubles arising from quarrels with his relatives, lawsuits about his property and his children, and his own highly strung temperament and fragile health. In 1880 he left England for Italy, and in 1822 was drowned while sailing across the Bay of Spezia. In the body of Shelley's writing, two poems stand outside any general classification that can be made. One is Adonais, a splendid elegy on the death of Keats. Other, the Cenci, a romantic drama on the subject really too horrible for treatment, which none the less rises in places to a height of tragic intensity which we can parallel only by going back to some of the greatest things of the Elizabethan stage. Apart from these, his poems fall into two divisions. There are, in the first place, his personal poems. Shelley's genius was essentially lyrical, and his moods, impressions, thoughts and emotions embodied themselves naturally in verse. As a lyric poet, he ranks with our very greatest, and no praise would be excessive for the ecstasy of feeling, the lightness and grace of felicity of phrase, and the verbal magic of such poems. For example, as the skylark, the cloud, the sensitive plant, the ode to the west wind, a lament. In the second place, there are the impersonal poems. Dreamer of dreams as he was, Shelley had conceived it to be a part of his poetic mission to become the inspirer and the guide of man. He had, as he confessed, a passion for reforming the world, and this passion blazes out again and again in his poetry, in flames that are now fiercely lurid and now matchlessly pure. As he explained in the preface to the Revolt of Islam, he believed that the reaction which had followed the revolution, though inevitable with those who did not look beneath the surface of things, would prove to be a temporary reaction only. Already he thought the gloom and misanthropy which it had bred were passing away, and thus, despite the surrounding darkness, he held that the dawn of the new day was at hand. Such was the faith to which he clung steadily through all the doubts and disappointment of his times. Such was the faith by which all his humanitarian poems were inspired. In Queen Mab, which he wrote at 18, his revolutionary creed had not yet passed beyond the destructive stage. Based on Godwin's political justice, whole passages of which are simply turned into verse. This violent and aggressive poem proclaims an individualistic philosophy of the most uncompromising kind. All institutions are condemned, kings and governments, church, poetry and marriage, while Christianity falls under the same sweeping censure. And even the extravagant diatribe is redeemed by that fine passion for humanity which formed the basis of Shelley's religion. The revolt of Islam, which followed in 1817, is a long rambling narrative in Spenserian stanza and is charged with the young poet's hope for the future generation of the world. As a story, it is confused and almost unintelligible, but it is very important as helping us to understand the fundamental difference between the Shelley and Byron as interpreters of the revolutions. Byron's heroes is Lara, Manfred, Childe Harold, Don Juan, and the rest of them are self-engrossed egotists and, I have said, mere rebel against society. Laon, the hero of the revolt of Islam, on the other hand, is filled with Shelley's own magnificent and unselfish enthusiasm. His one abiding purpose is to be the savior of society, and in the end he becomes a willing martyr for the cause of man. But the fullest and finest expression of Shelley's faith and hope is to be found in his super lyrical drama Prometheus Unbound. In this readaptation of the famous old Greek myth, the Titan stands forth as the prototype of mankind in its long struggle against the forces of despotism, symbolized by Jupiter, and the allegory closes with the magnificent choral outburst over the consummation of the divine purpose in the regenerated world. Keats, in John Keats 1795 to 1821, the last and the youngest of the later revolutionary group, we have a remarkable contrast both with Byron on one side and with Shelley on the other. Keats was neither rebel nor utopian dreamer. Endowed with a purely artistic nature, he took up his regard to all the movement and conflict of his time, a position of almost complete detachment. He knew nothing of Byron's stormy spirit of the antagonism to the existing order of things, and he had no sympathy with Shelley's humanitarian zeal and passion for reforming the world. According to his conception of it, poetry should be not the vehicle of philosophy, religious teaching, or social and political theories, but the incarnation of beauty. The famous opening line of Endymion, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever," strike the keynote of his work. "I have loved," he declared in one of his earlier letters, "the principle of beauty in all things," and as the modern world seemed to him to be hard, cold, and prosaic, as habitual sought an imaginative escape from it, not like Shelley into the future land of promise, but into the past of Greek mythology, as in Endymion, Lamia, and fragmentary Hyperion, or of medieval romance, as in the Eve of Saint Agnes, Isabella, and La Belle Dame Sans Merci. In his treatment of nature, his same passion for sensuous beauty is still the dominant features. He loved nature just for its own sake and for the glory of loveliness, which everyone found in it, and no modern poet has ever been nearer than he was to the simple poetry of earth. But there was nothing mystical in the love. The nature was never fraught for him as for Wordsworth and Shelley with its spiritual messages and meanings. Keats died of consumption before he had completed his 26th year, and is therefore, in Shelley's phrase, one of the inheritors of unfulfilled renown. Allowance must thus always be made for the immaturity and experimental character of much of his work. His genius was ripening steadily at the time of his premature death, and we can measure his moral and spiritual as well as artistic growth during his few years of his manhood by comprising his first little volume of verse published in 1870, or Endymion, which appeared the next year, with the contents of his third and the last volume, the volume of 1819, and especially with the great odes to Autumn, to a Nightingale, and on Grace Sian urn, but even as it is his place is assured, as Shelley prophesied with the enduring dead. Historically, he is important for three reasons. First, on the side of form and style, he is most romantic of the romantic poets, handling even his Greek themes with luxurious of language and a wealth of detail as far as possible removed from the temperance and the strength of Hellenic art. Here in particular we note his entire rejection of the classic couplet, for which, following the lead of his friend Leigh Hunt, he substituted couplets of the loose romantic type. Secondly, more than any other great poets of his time, he represents the exhaustion of the impulses generated by the social upheaval and humanitarian enthusiasm of revolution. With him, poetry breaks away from the interests of contemporary life, return to the past, and devotes itself to the service of beauty. It is for this reason that he seems to stand definitely at the end of his age. Finally, his influence was none the less very strong upon the poets of the succeeding generation. Other poets of the later revolutionary age. This was a period of great poetic activity, and only a few of minor poets can be mentioned here. Among them, special interest attached to James Henry Leigh Hunt because of his close relation with Shelley and Keats. It was in his Story of Rimini that the classic couplet was first rejected in favor of the freer form which had been employed by some of the pre-Augustan poets. In this innovation he was followed not only by Keats, as we have seen, but also by Shelley, though it should be added that in Keats' early experiment, as in the slipshod Endymion, freedom was carried to a degree of license which Hunt himself did not approve. The best of Hunt's work in his prose, but of this we shall speak later. Another poet on our list, Thomas or Tom Hood, is remotely connected with Keats, for he married a sister of Keats' most intimate friend, John Hamilton Reynolds, whose life was one protracted struggle against poverty and ill health, and of the work which he did under constant pressure of necessity during some 24 years of hack writing, and least one half may be set aside as valueless. He is perhaps chiefly remembered for his humorous poems, in which he proved himself to be our greatest master of verbal wit and punning. But his serious poetry should not be neglected, for he was true poet, if not exactly a great one. He wrote some superb ballads and lyrics like The Dream of Eugene Aram, The Song of Short, The Bridge of Saint Fair Inez. I remembered his ode to melancholy and his sonnet Silence are among the finest things of the kind in the language. The plea for the midsummer night fairies is full of graceful fancy. The haunted house is wrought with splendidly sustained imaginative power, while Miss Killy Menseg is a masterpiece in a very difficult form of poetry, the gruesome grotesque. With Hood we may associate Winthrop Mackworth Praed, a writer of admirable society verses, and Richard Harris Burham, whose ever delightful Ingoldsby legend are a burlesque development of the medievalism which Scott and other had made so popular. The Bates Tragedy and That's Just book of Thomas Lowell Beddoes. We have a strange revival of the morbid and fantastic spirit of the later Elizabethan drama. Two women poets, Felicia Dorothea Hemans and Letitia Elizabeth Landon, known as LEL, must also be named. They both wrote much fluent and graceful verse, which caught the romantic and the sentimental taste of the time and assured them a wide public. but they were both wordy and rather weak, and in the case of Lel particularly, there was a marked tendency to mere gush. Few people would now think of reading the longer work of either of these writers, but they possess a rather faint sort of historical interest, while some of Mrs. Hammond's shorter infusions still enjoy popularity in the children's book. So this is all about the today's session. Now we will continue it in the next video. Thank you for watching, and like, share and subscribe as much as you can. That's all.